Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're taking a major trip back in time to the 7th century CE to explore the life of a guy named Harshvardhana, though we're mostly just going to call him Harsha. Now, if you really want to understand the long, complicated history of India, you've kind of got to look at Harsha as this ultimate structural bridge. He stands right at that critical turning point where the ancient world of those massive, super-centralized empires starts to fade out, and the medieval era, the time of fractured regional kingdoms, really begins to wake up. So we're going to look at how he tried to pull a totally fragmented world back together, and why his methods basically rewrote the entire political playbook for early medieval India.
And we aren't just reading down a timeline today. We're unpacking a massive, epic of survival, relentless conquests, and the twilight of ancient India. Here's how the story's going to unfold. We'll kick things off with a kingdom in crisis, watch him uniting the north, dig into the dawn of feudalism, meet a very famous Chinese monk, and finally look at Harsha's legacy and fall. All right, let's dive right into Chapter 1, A Kingdom in Crisis.
Okay, the human drama that actually launched Harsha's reign is straight out of a thriller. Imagine inheriting a kingdom that is totally surrounded by enemies, bleeding internally, and teetering right on the edge of total collapse. Now, imagine dealing with all of that at 16 years old. Yeah, 16. Most kids that age are just figuring out life, right? Well, Harsha had to figure out how to keep an entire empire from evaporating. That was the reality he woke up to in 606 CE when he took the throne of the Pushyabhuti dynasty.
Because, the chaos leading up to his coronation was just absolute. Back in the 6th century, the mighty Gupta Empire collapsed, leaving northern India shattered into these little competing regional kingdoms. Harsha's father, Prabhakaravardhana, who had done a pretty solid job expanding their territory around Tanaser and fighting off Hun invasions, suddenly dies. So the crown passes to Harsha's older brother, Rajavardhana. But then, his brother is assassinated by rival kings. So suddenly this 16-year-old kid is thrust into the absolute top spot. And to prove he actually deserved to be there, his very first act as king was a dramatic, high-stakes rescue mission deep into the Vindhya forests to save his kidnapped sister, Rajyashri. I mean, you can't write this stuff.
Moving right along to Part 2, Uniting the North.
So, having secured his family and his shiny new throne, Harsha didn't just sit back and play defense. Actually, scratch that. He went on the absolute offensive. He strategically transformed from this besieged teenager into a hardcore empire builder. He pushed out, conquering Punjab, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Odisha, and parts of Bengal. He even went toe-to-toe with his brother's killer, the Gauda ruler Shashanka. But honestly, his smartest strategic move was packing up his capital and moving it from Thanesar to Kannauj. Kannauj wasn't just a change of scenery. It became the undisputed political center of gravity for North India, giving him this perfect command post for his expanding territory. But look, even Harsha couldn't conquer everything. And this brings us to a really fascinating geographic roadblock, the Narmada River. Harsha got ambitious and tried to push his massive army south into the Deccan Plateau. But right there on the banks of the Narmada, he hit a brick wall named Pulakeshin II, the Chalukya ruler. Pulakeshin handed Harsha a definitive defeat. So the Narmada River basically became a permanent line in the sand. Harsha gets North India, but the south, that remained completely out of his reach.
All right, let's look under the hood in Section 3, the dawn of feudalism.
So managing an empire that stretches across half a subcontinent, that takes resources, and it takes a totally new style of management. If you remember one word from this whole explainer, make it this one, Samanta. A Samanta was a feudatory chief. See, Harsha's central government wasn't quite as iron-fisted as the empires of the past, so he relied heavily on these regional bosses to run things on the ground. This is absolutely crucial, guys. It wasn't just delegating tasks. This was the very beginning of early medieval feudalism in India. Power was visibly slipping away from the king's throne and settling into the hands of these localized lords. You can really see this massive macro-historical shift when you put Harsha right next to the Guptas. The old Gupta Empire, very centralized, heavy bureaucracy, and a booming trade-based economy. But Harsha's empire, it's semi-feudal. It relies on those Samantas we just talked about, and economically, trade was drying up, so the state became deeply reliant on agriculture. The very DNA of what an Indian empire looked like was completely mutating during Harsha's rule. And since global trade and big cities were kind of on the decline, Harsha had to pay his bills somehow, right? The economic engine shifted almost entirely to land revenue. The state collected about 1/6 of the total agricultural output. And let me tell you, he needed every penny of that agrarian wealth. It funded an insanely huge military. We're talking massive infantry, elite cavalry, and a completely terrifying force of war elephants. Which brings us to Chapter 4, Culture and the Chinese Monk. Now, Harsha wasn't just a warlord collecting farm taxes. His reign was actually this brilliant cultural renaissance. And we are super lucky because we have a literal eyewitness to it. Xuanzang, the incredibly famous Chinese monk and traveler who hung out in India for years. His notes are just a goldmine. Xuanzang tells us Harsha ran an efficient ship with surprisingly mild criminal punishments, but he also notes that society was getting stricter. The Varna, or caste system, was super rigid. It was a heavily patriarchal society too, with Xuanzang mentioning practices like sati and child marriage popping up in certain areas. He also observed that vegetarianism was becoming widespread, and he confirmed what we suspected. Farming was great, but the big cities were definitely shrinking. But here is where Harsha gets really interesting. He had this wild dual identity. On one hand, you have Harsha the patron. He bankrolled brilliant minds, like his court poet Banavata, who actually wrote Harsha's biography, the Harsha Charita. And Harsha threw massive funding at Nalanda University, turning it into this buzzing international hub for thousands of students. But then you have Harsha the author. He wasn't just writing checks for artists, he was one. Harsha himself wrote 3 legit, highly regarded Sanskrit plays: Nagananda, Ratnavali, and Priyadarshika. I mean, talk about an overachiever. And his open-mindedness spilled right over into religion. Harsha was incredibly tolerant. He respected Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. He actually started out following Shaivism, but later really leaned into Mahayana Buddhism, mostly because he was so influenced by his buddy Xuanzang. And you can see his devotion in his famous grand assemblies. First, he threw the Kanauj Assembly, this massive Buddhist conference with kings, scholars, and Xuanzang as the guest of honor. Then there was the Prayag Assembly. Get this. Every 5 years in modern-day Allahabad, Harsha would literally empty his treasury. He gave away his accumulated wealth, his clothes, food, just massive charitable donations to the poor and religious groups.
Finally, let's wrap up with Section 5, Harsha's legacy and fall.
So despite the amazing plays, the grand charity, and uniting the North, Harsha's empire had a fatal flaw. It was basically a house of cards. When Harsha died in 647 CE, the whole thing just collapsed. Why? Because he didn't leave a capable heir. And honestly, the only thing holding those ambitious Samantas in line was Harsha's sheer magnetic personality. There was no deep, permanent bureaucracy. The minute he was gone, the regional lords declared independence. The North completely shattered, plunging right into the chaotic tripartite struggle of the 8th century, which ultimately set the stage for the rise of the Rajputs in the early medieval era. So here's what I want you to take away from all this. Harsha was an undeniable force of nature, a brilliant artist, a fierce conqueror, and basically the last guy to unite North India until the Delhi Sultanate came along centuries later. But his whole system was built on the extremely dangerous game of feudal decentralization, masked only by his own personal charisma. So as you look at the fractured, warring era that immediately followed him, ask yourself this. What actually happens when the fate of an entire empire rests on the shoulders of just one man? It's a pretty heavy question, and one that history keeps forcing us to answer. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and hey, keep questioning the past.